let's explore the social production of life through a Marxist lens. Marxist criticism is actually one of the oldest forms of modern literary theory, and it traces back to Karl Marx's ideas about culture and society in the 1850s. The core idea here is that human consciousness, how we think, what we believe, is not something that exists independently of our social and economic circumstances. Instead, it's shaped by them. So, when we talk about Marxist aesthetics, it's not just about how we think about literature. It's a praxis, a practical way of understanding and engaging with the world. It encourages us to see literature as connected to the material conditions of the time in which it was created. The main goal, then, is to analyze how literary works reflect, challenge, or are influenced by the historical conditions that shape human life. Essentially, this approach helps us understand literature as part of a larger social and economic fabric, an active part of how society produces and reproduces itself. This perspective ties directly into our overarching theme of examining culture as a social product. When we talk about being and consciousness, it's important to understand a key idea that Marx emphasized. He famously stated that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but rather their social being that determines their consciousness. What does this mean? Well, it shifts the focus from individual thoughts and ideas to the material conditions of life, like the economic and social structures that people live within. This idea actually reverses a traditional view from German philosophy, which held that history was mainly the unfolding of reason or spiritual essence. In contrast, Marx argued that our ideas, things like religions, laws, or ideologies, are actually products of our real, material economic existence. They reflect the conditions of our social and economic environment, rather than existing independently. And here's the crucial point. This shift isn't just about understanding the world differently. It's about using that understanding to actually change the world. Marx believed that by recognizing how economic and social structures shape our consciousness, we could work to transform those structures for the better. So, this slide highlights a fundamental idea in Marxist theory, that our social conditions shape our ideas, and that understanding this is the first step towards meaningful change. When we look at society, it's important to understand that it's organized around an economic base, which essentially means the relations of production, the way people produce goods and services, and how those relations shape the entire social structure. This economic foundation doesn't exist in isolation. It supports what we call the superstructure, which includes the legal, political, and ideological systems. These are built upon and influenced by the economic base. Now, from a human perspective, life isn't just about existing. It's about actively engaging in productive and purposeful activities. But these activities are always shaped by the historical circumstances we find ourselves in. So, our actions and decisions are constrained by the specific social and historical context we're part of. And this is a crucial point. The way society produces material goods doesn't just affect our economy. It actually conditions all other aspects of society, our politics, culture, and even our ideas. The mode of production, or how we organize our economic life, ultimately shapes the social, political, and intellectual processes that define our world. So, this interconnectedness reminds us that to understand society fully, we need to consider how the economic foundation underpins everything else we experience and believe. So, here we see how capitalism shapes the way our world functions. Under capitalism, everything starts to be viewed through the lens of commodities, objects that can be exchanged. This means that the world becomes more interconnected, more like a single, concrete whole. Now, a key idea here is the commodity form itself. It makes the value of things seem arbitrary because their worth isn't based on their inherent qualities, but rather on how they compare to other commodities. This leads us to a concept called reification. Essentially, human values, like social relationships, culture, or morality, get reduced to mere exchange values. In other words, they become just another commodity, something that can be traded or measured. And as a consequence, the human world becomes dominated by objects, which can feel dehumanizing. This dynamic doesn't just stay at the economic level. It influences our social and political organizations as well. They tend to become dehumanizing too, affecting how individuals experience their lives within these structures. So, in the bigger picture, this slide highlights how capitalism and the commodity form fundamentally reshape our social reality, often at the expense of our subjective human experience. Money, often called the universal signifier, is a powerful concept because it essentially erases distinctions between people and things. As Marx observed, it does away with all distinctions, meaning that money can level social differences and act as a disruptive force in social relations. This idea points to how money influences not just the economy, but the way society functions at a fundamental level. Now, capitalism creates what Marx called a phantasmagoria, a kind of illusion or deceptive appearance. This illusion hides the harsh reality of economic exploitation and the often brutal process of production. So, what we see on the surface, luxury, consumerism, is often just a facade that masks deeper social inequalities. In the modern era of finance capital, economics has become more than just a field of study. It's become the dominant language of society. This means that economic discourse shapes how we think, communicate, and even value things. It makes it challenging for other human values, like compassion, community, or ethics, to assert their importance against this economic narrative. And we see this dominance reflected strongly in culture. For example, when we describe a character's voice as full of money, it signals that social status and influence are now inherently tied to wealth. Essentially, money has become a measure of worth, turning history and social standing into functions of economic power. So all these points tie back to the larger theme, how money shapes our social fabric and perceptions, often invisibly, yet profoundly. It's a reminder of how economic forces influence everything from social relations to cultural values. When we talk about the concept of ideology, we're referring to the systems of representation that shape how we see the world. These can be aesthetic, religious, judicial, or other frameworks that influence our perceptions. Now, here's the key part. Ideology often serves the material interests of the dominant social class. It presents their views as common sense or natural, making these ideas seem like just the way things are, rather than products of specific social arrangements. This creates what we call an imaginary relationship to our actual conditions of existence. In other words, it gives us a certain illusion of understanding or acceptance, even when it might mask or repress the reality of exploitation happening around us. And this is where literature fits into the picture. Literature is part of this ideological sphere, sometimes reinforcing these dominant ideas, but other times unmasking or challenging them. So, understanding ideology helps us see how ideas and representations shape not just our perceptions, but also social power and structure. Let's talk about ideology and commodity fetishism. A key aspect here is what we call commodity fetishism. This is when the value that human labor creates is seen as an independent and objective property of the product itself. In other words, people start to believe that the value of a product exists outside of the social relations and labor that produced it. This process is really an aesthetic or imaginary one, meaning it's based on perceptions and illusions rather than reality. It prevents us from seeing the true social relations behind production. Instead of recognizing that products are the result of human effort and social arrangements, we see them as objects with intrinsic value. Now, this illusion plays a crucial role in how the market economy functions. It helps secure the interests of the dominant class by making these exploitative relationships seem natural or just part of how things are. This way, the social and economic inequalities are maintained because they appear to be normal and inevitable. Connecting this to the overall theme, it shows us how ideology works to mask the true nature of social relations, especially in a capitalist system. It's not just about economics, it's about how our perceptions shape the way we accept or challenge the social order. Let's take a closer look at late capitalism and the global market. Late capitalism is characterized by a global market that essentially permeates every aspect of our social, cultural, and economic lives. It's not just about economics anymore. It influences how we think, how we relate to each other, and even how we see ourselves. Now, postmodernism is often called the cultural logic of late capitalism. What does that mean? It reflects a society where images and representations have become so dominant that they often replace or distort reality. We live in a world of the imploded image, where the line between reality and its representation is blurred, and sometimes we lose touch with what's real. Despite the powerful reach of this system, the capitalist world order is maintained by a kind of superstitious veneration of the free market. People tend to believe in the market's virtues without fully understanding how it operates or the often monstrous, hidden mechanisms behind its success. It's like we blindly trust something that's actually quite complex, and at times, destructive. This is where Marxism still plays a crucial role. It remains a vital tool for critique, helping us analyze and challenge the system. Marxism offers a way to reconnect with the real relations, the actual social and economic connections that are often obscured by the spectacle of late capitalism. Especially in a world in crisis, Marxist critique can guide us toward understanding and hopefully transforming these underlying realities. Let's take a closer look at the metaphor Marx used to describe society, which is the base and superstructure. Think of society like a building. At its core, there's the foundation, or the base. This base is made up of the relations of production, which are essentially the class relations, and the material productive forces, like technology and resources. These elements form the economic groundwork of society. Resting on this base, we find the superstructure. This includes the legal and political systems, but also broader aspects like art, religion, and social consciousness. These elements reflect and support the underlying economic structure, but it's important to understand that the relationship isn't just straightforward or mechanical. The base conditions the superstructure, but the superstructure can also influence the base in complex ways. This metaphor helps us see how economic factors shape society's institutions and ideas, and reminds us that change in one area can affect the other. It's a powerful way to understand how society functions and evolves over time. When we talk about the economic base being the ultimate determinant, we mean that, in the end, the material conditions of society shape everything else. But, at the same time, Marxists acknowledge that culture, including art and philosophy, has a certain degree of asterisk relative autonomy. This means that culture isn't just a passive reflection of economic forces. It can influence and even transform human experience on its own terms. Art and philosophy, for instance, have their own independent power. They can challenge, inspire, and change how people see the world. They're not simply phantoms of the brain, but active forces capable of shaping social consciousness. Marx himself was intrigued by something he called the eternal charm of Greek art. Even long after the social and political structures that created that art became obsolete, the beauty and power of Greek art persisted. That shows us that art can achieve a kind of asterisk distanciation asterisk, a separation from the immediate economic and ideological forces surrounding it. So, in essence, while the economy is fundamental, art and culture can sometimes stand apart and influence society in ways that aren't directly dictated by material conditions. This interplay is crucial for understanding how ideas and aesthetics can contribute to social change, even within a primarily materialist framework. Marx was truly a cosmopolitan reader. He appreciated a wide range of authors from different eras and cultures. You see, he admired everything from the classical works of Virgil and Dante to more contemporary writers like Dickens and Thackeray. This broad interest highlights his belief in the importance of diverse literary voices. He observed that in modern times, the idea of national one-sidedness, or the tendency to focus only on national literature, becomes increasingly impossible. Instead, what emerges is a truly world literature that transcends borders and national boundaries. This idea aligns with the overall theme of interconnectedness and the global nature of culture and ideas. Marx also took a special interest in Shakespeare, compiling archives of his idioms. To Marx, Shakespeare wasn't just a playwright. He was like the Bible of his home, a foundational cultural figure whose works carried deep social and political significance. Finally, Marx believed that the creative imagination of writers and poets could reveal more political and social truths than professional politicians ever could. This underscores the power of literature, not just as art, but as a tool for understanding and transforming society. All these points connect back to the broader idea that culture and literature are vital in shaping our collective consciousness and social change. Let's take a closer look at the contrast between tendency and imaginative integrity. Marx was quite critical of writers who used their characters simply as mouthpieces for their own opinions. This practice is what he called tendency. Essentially, it means the writer is pushing a specific agenda through the characters, rather than letting the story unfold naturally. On the other hand, Marx preferred works where the narrative's logic and the power of imagination guide the story. In these cases, the story isn't forced to serve the writer's opinions, but instead develops organically. This approach is often referred to as the Shakespearean mode, where the work speaks for itself through its formal structure and idiom. It's important to recognize that a writer's explicit political stance is often less significant than the depth of their understanding of reality, which is reflected in their art. The true value lies in how well the work captures and portrays the complexities of life, rather than just pushing a specific political message. So, in the broader context of our presentation, this distinction emphasizes the importance of integrity in storytelling, allowing the narrative and imagination to lead, rather than editorializing or forcing a particular agenda. Let's talk about realism and the idea of the typical. Friedrich Engels defined realism as the truthful reproduction of typical characters under typical circumstances. Now, it's important to understand that typicality doesn't mean just an average or statistical norm. Instead, it refers to a concretization of the forces at play, those that give a narrative its historical significance. So, when we see realism, we're essentially witnessing a reflection of the social and historical forces shaping characters and events. Realism is often viewed as the epic of an age that has moved away from the comforting explanations of myth. It becomes a way to understand the complexities of modern life through detailed, truthful portrayals. Interestingly, Engels praised Balzac, even calling him reactionary, because he was more realistic than socialist writers. That's because Balzac offered a more penetrating account of social downfall, digging deep into the realities of society rather than framing them with idealism. In the context of our overall theme, realism helps us grasp how literature mirrors societal truths, sometimes uncomfortable, but always essential for understanding the human condition in a given era. Let's take a closer look at Soviet socialist realism. This artistic method was officially established in the 1930s as the way the Soviet Union wanted art to serve its ideological goals. It combined the realism of 19th-century bourgeois art with revolutionary politics, meaning it aimed to portray a positive, heroic view of Soviet life. At the same time, it rejected the modernist experiments that many considered decadent or too abstract. Two key principles guided socialist realism. One was partenost, which means a strong commitment to the party and its ideals, and the other was narodnost, or the focus on social awareness and connecting with the people's experiences. Interestingly, writers and artists weren't just creating for art's sake. They were seen as the engineers of the human soul, as Stalin put it. This meant their work was meant to shape and uplift the consciousness of the Soviet people, aligning with the broader goal of building a socialist society. So, in the context of this presentation, understanding socialist realism helps us see how art and culture were mobilized as powerful tools for political and social transformation during this period. Let's take a closer look at the reflection of totality. Lukács believed that for a work to be truly realistic, it must reveal the deeper pattern of contradictions within a social order. It's not enough to just describe surface details. Instead, the work should expose the underlying tensions that drive social change. He rejected what he called naturalism, which tends to focus only on surface-level descriptions and instead favored a dynamic reflection of reality, meaning that art should actively mirror the ongoing conflicts and contradictions. A novel, in this view, becomes a powerful tool for accessing the social totality, the entire network of relations, especially the relations of production that shape society. It offers a kind of imaginative insight into how these relations operate and influence people's lives. For Lukács, the great 19th century novelists serve as models for how art can make history understandable, especially for revolutionary classes. Their works help illuminate the social structures and conflicts at play, making complex historical processes more accessible and meaningful. So, in our overall theme of understanding social reality through literature, this slide emphasizes that true realism isn't just about depicting what appears on the surface, but about revealing the deeper social contradictions that drive historical change. So, here we see Brecht's stance as the anti-Aristotelian. He really rejected what we call Aristotelian theater, which traditionally relied on creating empathy and smooth, seamless plots to lull the audience into passivity. Instead, Brecht wanted to shake things up. He pioneered what's called the alienation effect, or Verfremdungseffekt, which is all about making the familiar world of social injustice seem shockingly unnatural. The idea is to prevent the audience from getting lost in the story and instead encourage critical thinking. Brecht believed theater should present facts as the outcome of human actions, especially those driven by exploitation, rather than portraying nature as inevitable. His main goal was to create contradictions within the audience, moments that make them question what they're seeing and feeling. Ultimately, he wanted to move viewers toward active political engagement, not just passive entertainment. This approach aligns with his broader aim of using theater as a tool for social change. So here we're looking at the Frankfurt School and their approach called critical theory. The key figures, Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, were quite skeptical of traditional realism, which they saw as inadequate when it comes to understanding modern capitalism. They believed that simply describing society wasn't enough. We also need to think about how to change it. That's where their idea of critical theory comes in. It's both analytical and transformative. They analyzed how mass culture functions as a culture industry. This is a really important concept because they argued that mass-produced culture, like movies, music, and television, serves to reinforce social conformity, making people accept the status quo without question. It's a way for society to maintain control. Now, an interesting point they make is about art. They see art as the only true space of resistance to what they call the administered universe of the 20th century. In other words, art has the potential to challenge the dominant social order and offer a form of liberation. Connecting this to the broader theme, it's about understanding how culture and art can either serve as tools of control or as spaces of resistance, something we should keep in mind as we analyze modern society and its structures. Let's explore the idea of art as negative knowledge. Adorno, a key figure here, argued that what makes art powerful is its detachment from everyday reality. This detachment isn't a flaw. Rather, it gives art the ability to critique society effectively. He described art as the negative knowledge of the actual world, meaning it acts as an irritant, something that disrupts our usual conformist trends. Adorno was a strong supporter of what we might call difficult or experimental art. Think of Kafka, Beckett, or Schoenberg, because this kind of art resists easy consumption. It challenges us and makes us think beyond surface-level entertainment. He believed that realistic narrative often just reproduces the facade of reality, what we see on the surface, without revealing deeper truths. So, in a way, realistic art can sometimes reinforce illusions rather than critique them. Overall, this perspective ties into our broader theme of how art can serve as a form of critical reflection, sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately necessary for understanding and challenging the world we live in. So, in this slide, we're looking at Benjamin's ideas about art and production. He argued that modern technologies like photography and cinema have really changed how we experience art. Specifically, they've destroyed what he called the aura of timelessness, that unique, almost sacred presence that great art used to have. Now, this reproduction of art, while it might seem like a loss, actually opens it up to politics. Instead of being something reverent or ritualistic, art becomes something we analyze critically, which can lead to new ways of understanding and engaging with it. Moving on, Benjamin's essay, The Author as Producer, emphasizes that revolutionary art isn't just about the art itself, but also about transforming the systems and forces that produce art. If we want truly revolutionary art, we need to rethink how it's created and circulated. Finally, he saw history as a series of discontinuous links rather than a straightforward, causal chain of progress. This perspective reminds us that historical change isn't always linear or predictable, but often happens through ruptures and shifts. All of these ideas connect to the broader theme of how technology and societal change influence artistic expression and our understanding of history. Let's explore Goldman's concept of genetic structuralism. Instead of focusing on the idea of individual genius, he emphasized what he called trans-individual mental structures that are shared within groups. This means he was more interested in how collective mental frameworks shape culture and literature rather than individual creativity. He also established the idea of homologies, which are structural correspondences. For example, he drew parallels between the structure of the modern novel and the structure of the market economy. This is a fascinating way to see how different systems reflect similar underlying patterns. Goldman observed that, especially in the late capitalist novel, the world of objects, things, and commodities begins to take the place of individual characters or personalities. This shift highlights how economic and material concerns start to shape narratives and characters themselves. His method, called genetic structuralism, aimed to directly connect literary structures to economic structures. Essentially, he was trying to show that literature doesn't develop in isolation, but is deeply intertwined with the economic and social contexts of its time. This approach gives us a powerful way to understand literature as part of a larger societal fabric. All right, let's delve into the concept of interpolation and ideology. Althusser suggests that ideology functions by hailing us, essentially calling us into specific subject positions. Think of it like a shout that turns us into particular kinds of subjects based on how we respond. Now, he also sees social formation as a dissented structure, meaning it's made up of multiple layers developing at different speeds and scales, which adds complexity to how ideology operates. When it comes to art, Althusser points out that it's bathed in ideology, it's everywhere around us. But interestingly, art also manages to retreat or create some distance from ideology, giving us space to see its limits and boundaries. And finally, he emphasizes that the subject isn't just a simple, rational individual. Instead, the subject is an effect, something shaped by unconscious processes and autonomous social practices. These ideas connect to the overall theme that our identities and perceptions are deeply intertwined with the ideological structures around us, often operating below our conscious awareness. When we look at Maschery's approach, he treats the text more as a production process rather than purely a creation. That means he's interested in how texts are put together, especially when working with different kinds of materials. One of the key ideas here is to pay attention to the silences and gaps within a text, those things that are left unsaid but are crucial for maintaining a certain ideological coherence. These gaps aren't accidental. They reveal the underlying assumptions and contradictions in the text. As critics, our task is to uncover these hidden rifts through what we call a symptomatic reading. This approach helps us see how literary forms actually congeal or solidify ideology, but in doing so, it also exposes internal contradictions that might be hidden at first glance. So, ultimately, this method allows us to understand not just what a text says, but what it implicitly reveals about the ideological forces shaping it. This ties back to our overall theme of analyzing how literature functions within larger social and political contexts. Let's talk about cultural materialism. Williams broadens the idea of culture beyond just high art. He sees it as a whole way of life. This means culture encompasses everyday practices, beliefs, and social norms that shape our existence. He also introduces the concept of hegemony, a term borrowed from Gramsci. Hegemony describes how social power isn't just enforced through force, but through consent. It's about how dominant groups influence society so thoroughly that their worldview becomes accepted as common sense. This is why certain social arrangements seem natural or inevitable, even if they benefit a particular class. In fact, this power is so deeply embedded that the order of a class society is often perceived as just the way things are, normal and unquestioned. Cultural materialism takes this further by analyzing all forms of signification, meaning everything from language to symbols, in relation to their material conditions of production. It emphasizes understanding how the material aspects of society, the economic and social structures, shape cultural expressions and ideas. Overall, this approach helps us see culture not as something separate from material reality, but as intertwined with the economic and social forces that produce it. Let's explore some key ideas from New Left Marxism. Terry Eagleton emphasizes that literature isn't just art, it's a special production of ideology. This means that texts reflect and shape social and political beliefs. He argues that criticism should become more like a science, systematically uncovering these ideological influences. One effective approach he suggests is to read against the grain, meaning we look beneath the surface to reveal hidden political messages or even socialist potential that might be obscured in traditional readings. Moving on, Friedrich Jameson introduces the concept of the political unconscious. He sees history as a brute reality, something raw and often difficult to confront directly. Texts, in his view, try to contain or suppress this reality, but they also reveal it if we look carefully enough. This idea reminds us that literature is deeply connected to the social and political forces of its time. Jameson also describes postmodernism as the cultural logic of late capitalism. Essentially, this means that postmodern culture, its styles, media, and messages, are saturated with the values and dynamics of a global, consumer-driven economy. It influences everything we see and experience, tying back to our overall discussion of how literature and culture reflect and shape political ideologies. These concepts help us understand the ongoing relationship between literature, history, and society in the context of Marxist theory. Today, I want to talk about Marxism as praxis. Even though some claim that Marxism has died out or is no longer relevant, it actually remains very important because it helps us understand the capitalist world order. It gives us tools to analyze how economic and social forces shape society, especially in times of crisis. This means it creates both the need and the opportunity to re-engage with the real relations that underpin our world, those underlying power structures and economic relations that often go unnoticed but have a huge impact on our lives. Now, Marxist aesthetics, whether in literature, art, or culture, serve a dual purpose. They provide a theory of how literature can reflect and critique society, but they also offer a praxis or a way of living and acting in the world. It's about engaging with culture not just passively, but actively to challenge and transform societal norms. And at its core, Marxism insists that human beings, rather than the so-called iron laws of necessity, are the ones who truly make their own history. This is a powerful reminder that change is possible and that we have agency in shaping our future. So, in the context of this presentation, Marxism isn't just an abstract theory. It's a call to action, a way of understanding the world that empowers us to create change and rethink our place within it.